Hello and welcome to this video that addresses the weird floating bonsai gimmick. To be clear, when we say abomination, we are referring to this style of floating bonsai. Specifically, this kind, as there are a number of variations. What distinguishes it is the complete lack of a pot. It is essentially a kokodama, but with what is supposed to be a bonsai inside of it. That is what makes it an abomination. The reason we call this kind of floating bonsai out specifically is that it exhibits all the weaknesses of a bonsai while having none of the strength. Essentially, it is a crippled bonsai that has then had its knees taken out and its hands taped together. It's now expected to thrive in a competitive environment. You can imagine that this will not be a favourable scenario. Our problem with it can be simplified to three things. 1. Water. 2. Light. 3. Support. This particular design makes the worst decisions for these and thereby makes them even worse, while also not giving any advantages other than aesthetic appeal, which is all well and good, but it's only good for a disposable item, and bonsai should not be treated as such. Starting with water. You can grow some species of bonsai in a kokodama bowl. You do need to choose the right species, but it can be done. There's no issues with that part. The key to it is ensuring the bowl's kept moist but not wet. That is, it should not drip water but always have some water present. In a floating kokodama bowl like this, it'll be true for a time, but it will dry out much quicker. In fact, it has very much to dry out quicker because all the parts are exposed to the air, and therefore the water will dissipate in all directions that much quicker. In a vase, planter, or pot, as we've shown with our kokodama, you keep at least one side or aspect protected, ensuring that it retains some moisture and keeps the plant alive. Of course, in a regular bonsai pot, the soil does that, and the pot ensures that, for the most part, 3 out of the 4 directions are entirely protected and retain moisture. Of course, such designs are just not practical to do when the whole of the bowl floats. There is no way with a kokodama style to do this. The other problem is that, in some respects, too much moisture retention. Now this can happen with the use of sphagnum moss particularly, and if it is not carefully matched to your bonsai, that will lead to root rot. That means both extremes will be a problem and likely to be present in many cases if you do not choose a good floating bonsai. This means the appropriate choice of species, setup, and application. And to be blunt about it, most of these commercially or mass manufactured versions are not carefully considered. Next is light. Well, perhaps it's better to say exposure. That is, a floating device like this will use electricity and magnets. Because of this, it must be either inside or near to inside if you do not have external power. That also means your species must be compatible with low light conditions or being kept indoors. There are a limited number of species that match with this. Most of those species are not found in the advertising for the floating bonsai. You can imagine when you have an incompatible species being kept indoors practically year-round that it will die, and die very soon. Which means that again, your nice bonsai is nothing but a dying branch, and it will soon become just a branch, forgoing the dying part entirely. If you do not choose to forgo the floating aspect, at least for now, you would still need to adjust for the light, heat, and exposure conditions. For example, putting the floating bonsai in a shaded, but still somewhat light place. A place that does not get too hot, but also not too cold. Finally, if you keep the bonsai indoors all year round, it will not ever get a chance to enter dormancy. This will have notable negative effects on the health and well-being of the bonsai, assuming it survives that long. So yeah, this entire thing being intended to be kept indoors as a display piece? No, it's a terrible idea. Last, we have support. Styling these bonsai and supporting their growth is and will be a nightmare. To start with, we have wiring. Wiring typically relies on some kind of anchor point. Nominally, this is the very first wire you place on the tree as it goes into the soil at the base of the nabari and then up the trunk. Everything sort of branches off from this. That is very hard to do when it is, well, set up like this. The floating makes it very difficult. If you put your, bit of random metal wire in there, you may well interrupt the ability to, use the magnet effectively and allow it to float. In other cases, you might just disrupt all the other processes going on, which could be a problem if it's copper wire particularly, less so if it's aluminium, but still. Even if you avoid that issue, you now have gone and added a significant amount of weight to the tree. The branches are very unlikely to be uniformly wired, so one side will inherently be heavier than the other. The magnet has best be strong enough to stop it falling over. If it doesn't, it will smash on the table or other surface when it tips over. If it is only that side of the tree that lands with a sudden impact, well, only one side of the tree will be significantly shorter. If it lands at a very unfortunate angle, most of the tree will be significantly shorter when it breaks. Lastly, we have things like fertilizer and similar. You can relatively easily apply fertilizer in this scenario. That is, if you were to use something like a liquid fertilizer, which would be the best case solution. But in more practical terms, people generally rely on slow-release fertilizer. For example, little baskets that you put your fertilizer into and it gradually breaks down over time. A liquid fertilizer in this case is really only fixing a problem that the design has created. It's entirely avoidable otherwise. Now, to be very clear about this, these are not an utterly terrible idea, just a mostly terrible idea. The basic premise is nice, but it does not work in this particular way. The use of kogodama style, let's say holders, pots, or something similar, is simply not going to be complementary to bonsai, and as mentioned, it exacerbates many of the weaknesses that exist. By contrast, a pot-based floating bonsai is significantly better. There are still some issues with it, but they are minor by comparison, and for the most part, these issues are still present in other examples of normal bonsai, depending on the nature of the pot chosen, the species, and so on. So at least in broad terms, they're certainly no worse than other bonsai and bring in certain strengths that just aren't present with a traditional or standard bonsai design and pot. But with this as it is, no, it's an abomination, at least when it comes to bonsai. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.